for your safety. And so they have had to go through an extensive period of training and capacity building to ensure that, one, they understand the craft, the aircraft that they are working on, and two, they understand how to keep the passengers on that aircraft safe. This is no different. The standards of training, certification, and watchkeeping for seafarers outlines a number of proficiency requirements for persons working vessels. These are the more advanced areas. They cover, Mr. President, personal survival techniques, firefighting and fire prevention, basic first aid, personal safety and social responsibility, proficiency in social awareness, and specifically in this case, the International Maritime Organization has tailored a very specific training regime for small boat masters and boat operators, and it is called the IMO Code of Safety for Small Commercial Vessels Operating in the Caribbean. So it has been made specific to our locale and to our jurisdiction. And this, Mr. President, has been incorporated in the bill that is before us. And so, Mr. President, you will have the tertiary level institutions who are here in Barbados also working along with the Maritime Administration to ensure that they're offering certified courses, training courses that are compliant with the requirements that are there. This is captured, Mr. President, at clauses 148.2 and 152 of the bill. This is captured there, Mr. President, and it requires for there to be basic training as well as relevant advanced training where applicable. But, Mr. President, the bill does not stop there. It does speak about, Mr. President, I talked about the age earlier, but we also want to make certain there are too many Barbadians, and we've heard the Honorable Prime Minister and the former Minister with responsibility for maritime affairs and the blue economy. You've heard, I believe, the Minister with responsibility for sport as well, speak about the number of Barbadians who cannot swim, who are unable to swim, who may go to the beach but may stay at the shoreline and just put their feet in the water, or sometimes they go a little bit further. But the need for Barbadians to learn how to swim remains an imperative and a priority for this government. I remember, Mr. President, being a secondary school student in the St. Michael's School, and every Monday, I think it was, we used to have to leave the St. Michael's School, walk along the back of the Belleville area in our class from first form, go across George Street, and go to what used to be the Ursuline Convent to their pool, because St. Michael's girls had to learn how to swim. That was the requirement back then when I was a student. But we had a swimming pool within walking distance. There are schools that have swimming programs still at the Aquatic Center and elsewhere, and there are swim programs at various beaches. But the need for Barbadians to be able to swim is critical. And so, Mr. President, this bill makes it clear that even where persons who are enjoying water sports activities, but they cannot swim, the expectation is that the person operating that water sport or operating that small vessel must be able to keep them safe, and in the event of an emergency, they must be in a position to respond. And that is why, Mr. President, this training is important. Mr. President, I want also to point out that the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport and other ministries at this point, including the National Sports Council, and I know of camps being held by, I believe, the Barbados Sailing Club, they have summer camps that are probably going to be running now for young seafarers, not just to learn how to swim, but to learn how to sail for recreational purposes, making sure that Barbadians have an affinity to the sea from a young and an early age. And the goal of that, Mr. President, is to ensure that we can educate our young people and create not just an opportunity for them to enjoy the sea, but to see an opportunity for a livelihood later on in life. So, Mr. President, I want to move on very quickly to the legislation, which is going to require a couple of things that I think are important. Under the legislation calls for, under the general operating agreements for Barbados vessels, it talks about how it must be registered. It says that the vessel operators must be competent. I've spoken about the age. It also includes, Mr. President, an operating requirement that a policy of insurance or other equivalent form of security must be held in respect of vessels, and that those vessels must be seaworthy. In clause 25 of the bill, the vessels entering Barbados' waters that do not bear our flag must receive vessel clearance. They must also have insurance or another equivalent form of security, and they must have evidence of documentation from their country of registry to verify vessel recommendation. We have vessel registration, Mr. President, I'm sorry. We also know that there are seasonal vessels that come into Barbados' waters, especially around this time of the year normally. These are now categorized as foreign registered pleasure vessels that can remain in Barbados under the existing legislation. They can remain for 6 months and get a cruise permit, and that is to be done under the Maritime Administration. And the cruise permits will allow for foreign registered vessels to remain on island for a period of a year, Mr. President. That's the maximum period that they can remain on island. Mr. President, this is important legislation, not just in terms of the technical recommendations, but also the specific operating recommendations. Part 5, Mr. President, clauses 84 to 114 speaks about the specifics now of the operating requirements. You have a requirement for a Barbados small vessel operator's license. This license will be required for operators of Barbados registered vessels, regardless of class or description. And the license really is going to give evidence that the person has the requisite training to which I referred and or experience and can operate a small vessel, whether for leisure or for commercial purposes. There are 3 categories of this license, Mr. President. Category 1 speaks to a vessel of a maximum length of 24 meters, a jet ski or other water sports craft, and any other class of small vessel. Category 2 in the legislation speaks to a person who is competent to operate a small vessel, slightly smaller, 18 meters in length, a jet ski, or other water sports craft. And in category 3, the third and the final category, it captures persons who are competent to operate a small vessel. So you have 24 meters long, 18 meters long, or 12 meters long. In this last category, it is 12 meters in length, a jet ski, or a water sports craft. This is all captured, Mr. President, in Part 5, clauses 84 through 114 for the benefit of the public. Mr. President, the vessels are in excess of, as I mentioned before, a certain length and weight, which will be 150 gross tons or 24 meters in length, are not captured in this legislation because they are not defined as small vessels. There are also a number of commercial operating requirements. You must have license endorsement. Now, Mr. President, in the education sector, for instance, if I have a CXC, a CAPE, CSEC, whatever that qualification is, I can go from one country in the region to another. I can go from this country to the UK. I can use it to access matriculation into a higher education institution at a tertiary level. We are also making sure, Mr. President, that those persons who are making their livelihood using these licenses are able to have portability and equivalence in their licenses. And so licenses, Mr. President, will have the benefit of, in trade, we call it a mutual recognition agreement, where you're able to transfer that license from one place to the other. And so the licensed operators, in the case of Barbados, operated small vessels who have obtained their training, their certification, and experience in small vessels handling from recognized institutions, they will then be recognized. They will not be required to obtain a Barbados small vessel operator's license. They will be issued a license endorsement to commercially operate a Barbados small vessel, and that would apply in the reverse as well. So we're talking here about mutual recognition and acceptance of maritime training and certification in the maritime industry, Mr. President. Now, I want to also make reference to the next section of the Part 6, clauses 115 to 164 of the legislation. This builds on what I just outlined, Mr. President, and it creates an opportunity, again, for continuity. We have people who drive heavy-duty licenses. We have people who drive cars, people who have been long-standing drivers like myself. I got my driver's license when I was maybe 16, 17, something like that. But a few years ago, correct. Yes. But This morning, Mr. President, for example, as I was driving down Salters Road, there was a car in front of me, and it said, "Please be patient, I'm a learner." And so we have learner drivers on the road. Equally so, this legislation in Part 6, clauses 15 through 164, establishes a regime for there to be learner's permits. So you have Barbados small vessel learners who will have a permit to learn how to sail, and this is a prerequisite for qualification of the actual operator's license, and that can be found in the legislation. For those persons, Mr. President, on the other side of the spectrum, so you have those who are doing it now, those who are learning to do it, learning to sail, people who are coming in up and ready, but you have those who have been doing this thing for generations and generations upon generations. The legislation provides, Mr. President, in Clause 88 for a grandfathering of the qualifications of those persons. So if you have had a license and you are a veteran, you will be appropriately grandfathered in from the existing speedboat licensing regime into the domestic shipping vessels regime under the small vessel operator's license. And so this is captured, Mr. President, in subparagraphs 2, paragraphs A and C of Clause 88, which covers the grandfathering. Who does this apply to? A person who has held a speedboat driving license for more than 5 years, but less than 10 years immediately before the commencement of this act. They will then be the ones who are grandfathered into Category 2, and a person who has held a speedboat driving license for more than 1 year, but less than 5 years, they will be grandfathered into Category 3. I did mention the categories earlier. And so if a person, however, under Clause 133 of the bill wants to advance to a higher category of competency, then the person would take the necessary training to make sure that they're able to provide the corresponding certificate of competency. Under Part 7, clauses 65 through 177, Mr. President, this is why we take things in part as well. This is why we cover the parts of legislation, even though there are specific clauses within it. Part 7, clauses 165 to 177, speaks about sea surveys, seaworthiness, and the inspection and the certification of vessels. So you have the requirement for a qualified marine surveyor to inspect the vessel, to ensure that you have an initial survey, that is before it is put into operation. You have an annual survey after it has been put into operation, and the vessel then is remaining, it's done annually, it is remaining in seaworthy condition, and then you have a renewal survey. This is conducted prior to issuing a 5-year certificate of seaworthiness. And then we get into Part 8, Mr. President, which covers clauses 178 to 191, and these are the general safety duties which are assigned to the boat owners, boat manufacturers, the boat operators, the crew, also to passengers. And then you have in Part 9, Mr. President, your most general of safety requirements, which is a further improvement on Part 8, which covers things relating to navigational safety, safety of life at sea, and environmental safety. This has been a comprehensive body of work, Mr. President, that has covered not just the work of the Ministry with responsibility for maritime affairs, but also, Mr. President, in the sections of parts 10 through 13, it then proceeds to cover the general environmental regulations and ensuring that through parts 10, through clauses 202 and 214, that you're covering issues relating to things like vessel cleaning activities, how to treat the garbage generated from small vessels, what happens with oil and oily waste generated from small vessels, sewage, chemicals, vessel refueling activities, emissions, even noise, Mr. President. Those are captured in clauses 202 to 214 in supporting both the work of the Maritime Ministry and the Environmental Ministry, which are now together. In Part 11, clauses 215 to 232, it speaks to marine salvage and wrecks and what needs to be done in the instance where there are wrecks and removing that from the ocean, the sea. In Part 12, it talks about abandoned, derelict, and stray vessels. Part 12, clauses 247 to 249. And then finally, Mr. President, that I want to deal with at this point in the legislation, we're talking about the enforcement regime. The enforcement regime is captured in Part 14, clauses 280 to 293, and it outlines what is the enforcement regime. It is a comprehensive body of work. And Mr. President, each time we deal with maritime legislation, I speak all the time, and I ask your permission again to do so, in glowing terms about Barbados's lone government official who is the maritime lawyer in the ministry with responsibility for tourism and international transport, Ms. Najla King, who has worked tirelessly on updating since 2018 all of these maritime laws. Every body of legislation that has come to us in the maritime space has come from this young woman who would have gone off to do her qualifications at the IMO Institute itself, and has come back and has given yeoman service to the government. And I want to express the appreciation to her for her sterling service to the government in ensuring that we are up to date. Mr. President, this is the bill before this honorable chamber. There are, of course, miscellaneous provisions captured in Part 15, clauses 294 to 309. Many of those things I have spoken about in greater detail, but it mines it a little bit further. But I want to commend this bill to the honorable chamber, and I want to commend the continued work of the ministry dealing with the maritime and shipping industry. But I also want to say to the maritime community that you continue to benefit from the absolute support of this government. The maritime community, the water sports community, the small craft vessels and operators, this legislation balances regulations, creating livelihoods, protecting individuals, but also raising the standard to ensure that people see this as a space in which they can craft a future, they can build a future for their future generations, but also they can earn a living and a solid commercial living that meets the highest standards locally and globally. And with these words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Any speakers, if there are none? Senator Malibu.
Thank you, Mr. President. Briefly, as usual. A couple of things, sir, on this bill that come to my attention. I think, first of all, long needed, so excellent, and it is a comprehensive piece of work. It does deal with the registration, regulation, the actual fit for purpose of the vessels. I'm a little bit concerned about the conduct of the operators, and I'm going to come back to that, sir. So I think that perhaps we could have done a bit more here, or perhaps leader of government business would explain to me where this will be dealt with. The training, certification, enforcement, safety, etc. First thing I would perhaps like to ask a question of, because it was not exactly clear to me in the legislation, and I am disappointed in myself that I was not able to clear this up before, but jet ski operators today, as far as I'm aware, are renting jet skis to young people at times to use the jet skis, and I'm not aware that there is any age limit imposed on those who are renting the vessel, the jet ski. The legislation seems to me to say, for the future, that you could only operate a jet ski if you are 16 years or older, is what it says. Now, that may well be appropriate, because frankly speaking, having on a few occasions used the jet ski, I recognize that it is a kind of a unique experience with quite a powerful piece of equipment that can easily get away from you. And as much as I might think that I am quite adept at powerful machinery in the water, it is different. It is a lot different. It is a lot different. So I understand as it applies to jet skis. But I would say, sir, that I'm also aware that as part of our culture, living on the water, that we often see young people operating very small, let's call them, I think the word they use often is zodiacs, these rubber dinghies with very small horsepower engines, like 15 horsepower engines and so on. And I've seen them in Carlisle Bay, you know, very small little engine, and they go to do a little fishing, and it's kind of the start of them really enjoying this. And I wonder if it was intended that this legislation would prohibit our young people under 16 being able to operate those very low horsepower, small dinghies. So that was just a matter of clarification on there, because I know that that is part of it. So I really want to turn my comments in two places relating to this legislation. The Section 178 of the legislation is very specific, and it applies to the owner of the vessel being operated. In this case, I want to refer to a jet ski. It has been my experience that many of the persons offering jet ski rentals on the West Coast, where I often see them, are not actually the owner of that jet ski. They might be the operator. This rule, this legislation, puts significant requirements on the owner of that vessel. And I cannot find the nexus, if that's the right word, to the operator and what will be the consequences of someone who is operating a vehicle but is not the owner of it. And this is where I have seen significant issues. And I think all of us in this room, and many whom perhaps are listening or watching, have seen it. And the behavior that I'm going to refer to as bad behavior that I was hopeful that they would be addressed in here is, for example, driving the jet skis at high speed in congested areas. I have seen the practice of accelerating the jet ski from the water to the water's edge and running it up the beach when there are people walking around. I have seen all of that go on, and I don't know, and perhaps I am, of course, available to be directed as to exactly where it is in this substantial piece of legislation that we are treating to the behaviors that we expect. Let's liken this, sir, to what we have with motor vehicles. Motor vehicles, we all have to go and get a license, and we separate the responsibility of the owner of the motor vehicle from the licensed operator of the motor vehicle, from the rules and regulations within certain areas that you can use that motor vehicle. And I think in the case of these small pleasure crafts, especially ones that are being rented, that we should have some more robust rules surrounding how these jet skis can be operated. So I look forward to hearing a bit more about that. And one last thing in that area is, and I think that the legislation is mute on this, is I would have hoped to have seen a very strict set of regulations surrounding the impaired operation of, or the operation of a vessel while impaired. We have been struggling now for a few years in Barbados to implement what's commonly called drink driving rules. We have some practical issues with getting it, and I do hope for the day when we will have it fully and completely implemented and enforced. If it is not covered well in here, sir, I do hope that we would have the opportunity to make sure that it is so, because there have been, and I see it, I think any of the fellow senators who maybe have subscribed to Flow TV, I think the NBC channel that we get is a Miami channel. So often if you happen to watch the NBC News at 6 o'clock or something on an evening, which I might do from time to time, it always surprises me the number of boating accidents that happen with pleasure vehicles where there is impaired boating involved. And that worries me, sir. It worries me on this. So I do hope that it is robustly handled within the legislation, and I have just missed it. So my last bit of time I would like to spend on this is I'd like to go back to the very first thing that Senator Cummings, in introducing this bill, mentioned. And what Senator Cummings said is that, and I may get it not exactly right, says, Beaches are who we are. I could not agree more. I could not agree more, sir. And I could not stand here today and not share with you, sir, and share with this group the significant crisis that we as a country face on our West Coast today with the erosion of our beaches. It is a threat that we as a country have to come together as one and address. There are many songs that Senator King will help me with the words, but from the mighty Gabby, that the beaches belong to we. And I agree, the beaches belong to we. But the responsibility for the beaches also belong to we. We all benefit from them. Many, many tourists come to the island and they'll come here and tell you how great the food was, or they'll tell you how great the sporting event was, sir, or they'll tell you about the culture or visiting family. But almost every tourist who comes to Barbados enjoys our beaches. That's what we are known for. But sir, today, if I took you to the west coast of the island, you would shed tears with me. Beryl has treated us rough. And we need to prepare for this. What was possibly a 1-in-100-year storm may now need to be recalibrated to a 1-in-20 or a 1-in-30. I'll let the experts decide. But a storm that came from the southwest side with 20 to 30-foot swells that decimated our fishing fleet, decimated our beaches on the west coast. That's what we need to earn our tourism dollars. It's what we are. We are these beaches. There are many, many places on the west coast today, sir, where from the point you step off of the road to the water's edge is inches, where it used to be feet and yards before. And I believe that as part, one of the pressing issues, and there are many in front of the government of Barbados, but one of the issues that I believe will come to the front burner very quickly, and I hope that it does so, is a comprehensive plan for the protection of the West Coast and South Coast beaches. It is going to be a monumental effort. It is going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars to do it. But we are going to have to do it because tourism is our business. The beaches do belong to we. It is part of our culture. And all that we're talking about with this piece of legislation relies on having great beaches for us to enjoy our culture, enjoy the legacy of our tourism, our fishing, etc. So, sir, while it is not specific to the Shipping Domestic Vessels 2024 Act, which, as I said earlier, I think is a robust piece of legislation, there are some areas which I have pointed out that I would like more clarification on. And I hope that it is there, and if it is not there, it would follow later with some rules. I think it's a good piece of legislation. It will have my support as it proceeds today. But I ask you all to spare a thought for what is the pressing issue that we have to protect the beaches on our west coast for what might be many more storms like Beryl to come, unfortunately. With those few words, sir, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Malalo. Her Honour, Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to just observe that I concur completely with the Honourable Senator who just spoke. There was a point when I used to walk from Bats Rock to the flour mill almost every day. And over a period of time, you could see the tremendous changes along the coastline. And other coastal areas, which I didn't walk regularly, but visited from time to time, you can see the deterioration of the coastline. You can see sand accretion or sand loss. And it is having an impact on beach quality, access to the beaches for recreation, spaces that tourists can enjoy. And it does have implications really for the cost of management of our coastal areas in protection not only of our tourism product, but in protection of the natural patrimony for the use and benefit of Barbadians. The senator is right. This is our principal foreign exchange earner, and we have to see the money that needs to be spent on the coast as an investment on which we will earn a return. But if we fail to make the investment equally, we are going to have significant adverse impacts in consequence. Many people commend the boardwalks, well, one is board, one is not, along the south and west coast, not recognizing that both of those were in fact engineered coastal defenses against the ravages of climate change in an attempt to stabilize those beaches for exactly the kind of usage of which the senator spoke. In fact, having been the Minister of Environment at the time who was responsible for executing those projects, and in particular the South Coast, which was the first, I can tell you that while there are now tremendously enjoyed and used and praised, that it was a very, very difficult project to execute. You would be amazed at the level of resistance that government faced from the property owners along the coastline. It was an awful, difficult, and long fight in order to get those boardwalks in place. But now that people see the benefit of it at the social level and at the economic level, and now that a businessman has spoken to the importance of that kind of work and that stabilization, I am hoping that others will see the benefit of it. And when government has to make this expenditure, which is very, very high cost, because of the area with which you're working, because of the material that is required, because of the level of design engineering that has to go into it if it is to be effective, that people will understand that this is not wasteful but essential expenditure. Sir, I want to take this opportunity to also make a few observations around a number of social and economic issues. I am not going to speak to the legislation itself, sir. Very often, you know, it is my inclination to look to the consequences or the implications or the benefits or disadvantages of legislation rather than speaking to the substance or the details of the law in the body of the legislation. For me, sir, to watch the Jolly Roger sink was a source of great sadness. Sir, I remembered days and nights spent on that boat, dancing to calypsos into the wee hours of the morning, the parties there. It was perhaps the first party boat in Barbados. And people of my age group and slightly younger and some older would have experienced a great deal of nostalgia and sadness. Oh, well, I see that our Senator Nurse is also smiling with nostalgia and remembrance. But to suffice it is to say, sir, that we, like many people across Barbados, would have had many a happy hour, almost literally, sir, on that boat. So that it was a significant loss, I'm sure, to the owners, but for all of those owners of vessels who suffered loss as a result of Beryl, I really want to say how very much it has been a source of pain for all of us to see what is people's investment, to see what is people's livelihoods, to see what is people's property lost in a matter of hours. And I would wish to extend my sincere wishes that we are all able to recover from this, because it is a national law. So let us concede that insofar as the fishing fleet is adversely affected, I think some 264 boats were damaged, only 19 of those were insured. That given the fact that this fishing fleet is now diminished in number by this event, and it will take some time to get them seaworthy again or replaced, that it is going to have implications for costs in the market, availability of product, people being out of place, out of work, displaced, and so on. So it is with concern, even though this piece of legislation does not relate specifically to the fishing sector, insofar as it touches and concerns the maritime affairs, then it is worth mentioning, sir. I want to focus on a few areas that I think the legislation naturally precipitates, and to speak to them in some detail. There are quite a few, so I won't have time to, as people like to say, drill down or interrogate them at any length, but I think it would be enough to mention them. First of all, I think it is important, sir, that government is in fact seeking to put regulatory measures in place in respect of the uses of marine space and territory, because there are myriad competing uses for our beach and coastal waters. There are myriad competing uses, and Senator Malalu again spoke to part of the concern, and that is the unregulated use of this competing space, or of space for which there is competition, where one sees reckless usage in some instances, and therefore some control measures need to be put in place to ensure, we are lucky that there are not more accidents, but to ensure that some regimen of regulation exists which preempts of incidents that might be of danger or harm to users of our marine space. In that regard, legislation which addresses the issue of the protection of the fishing stocks, the safety of swimmers, the type and usage and management and regulation of small craft of the type we are looking at here, and the usage of the various spaces that all of these enterprises will enter is really of importance, and it is importance too in the context of resilience building. We have to be very careful about the sustainability of that space, about the discharges that we allow in the ambient environment, about the discharges that we allow in our marine environment, about the implications of those discharges for the fish stocks, about the implications of those of discharges or movement of certain types of craft and vessel for reefs or for other areas, so that protecting our marine space, if you are an island, I make the point all the time that in a country as large as the United States, if something happens in Alaska, it has no meaning for anybody in New Jersey or in the Midwest. But in a small island where our maritime space exceeds our terrestrial space, the regulation and protection of that space becomes of the utmost importance. And I'm therefore very supportive of the efforts manifested by this legislation to put appropriate regulatory regimes in place. Let me also make the point, sir, that I love jet skis, I have to tell you. The idea of a vessel with that kind of power, and you are able to control it and go at tremendous speed, and the wind is just blowing all around you and the water is splashing on you, it is just It is just unparalleled. I just love it. So I love jet skis. I confess that I am a lover of speed. Yes, yeah. Very, yes, very in control. You are in control of this vessel. It is just, and the sensations are great as it slaps against the water. No, I mean, I think people are perhaps reading a lot into that, but it is lovely that the surge through the water. Sir, he started it. So but because I love jet skis and because I've had the opportunity to use them and to enjoy that water sport from time to time, I think there are 2 or 3 points which I would wish to make here. I didn't see it in the legislation, but I think it is absolutely imperative for government to mandate that jet skis should be fitted with tracking devices which allow them to be monitored wherever they go around the Barbados coastline. And there are, in fact, also tracking devices that once they get out of the Barbados territorial waters but still remain in the Caribbean, they can be found. It is critical for the loss of these vessels, perhaps during bad weather or in circumstances where an operator, a visitor may fall off and the vessel goes astray. It can drift in the tide and you have to spend some time looking for it. Whereas if it has the tracking device, you can immediately identify its location. But more important, sir, we have had 2 tourists rent a jet ski and disappear from sight. The jet ski itself turns up later on. But where the tracking system is embedded on the device, you would have been in a position to know, and it was found in another Caribbean island allegedly, but where such a tracking system was embedded on the device, you would have been in a position to know everywhere that it went, and therefore may possibly better have been able to create a narrative of what really could have taken place, other than that 2 people left the coast with a jet ski, and then the jet ski ended up in another island without the 2 people, and the 2 people are not seen since. I am suggesting that this is something that might have some value for future amendment, both for safety of persons, for interception or investigation of criminal or other activity or enterprises, and for protecting the loss of a person's asset, or the disappearance of a person's asset. I want to say that we haven't looked at it, but for those people who are operators, particularly on the West Coast, they complain about damage being done to the industry by persons whom they call flat-footers. The flat-footers, and I think, again, this is something to which Senator Malalou spoke about, the proper regulation or registration of operators and the responsibilities, liabilities, and duties placed on owners and operators. These flat-footers are people who manage to get craft. They come on the beaches. They compete with licensed, legitimate operators. There's no requirement for you to ask anybody to show that they are a licensed operator when they're on the beach. Somebody says, do you want to ride? And they give you the rate and you say yes or no. You don't know if they're insured. You don't know their status. So these flat-footers come on, they compete with legitimate, licensed and regulated operators. They charge cutthroat prices because, they're not operating under the same conditions, and they engage in activity in which they are prepared to sell legal and illegal products, and in some cases, sell personal services, sir. Those on the West Coast, particularly who are legitimate operators, have complained about the extent to which the flatfooters adversely impact their business and their reputation, and the fact that they do not operate with the same, that is, when I say they do not operate, the flatfooters do not operate with the same degree of restraint and within the rules which those who have a vested interest in the industry and own a craft would tend to operate. Because flatfooters may be somebody who are just breaking a job, trying to make a piece of change one day or another, or this month, but next month they're going to be doing something else. They might be doing ZRs next month. So that they do not have a vested interest in the industry and can operate with a high degree of recklessness, which is then attributed to the genuine, legitimate, registered operators. So we have to be concerned about that. We also have to place some kinds of rules or suggestions. Sometimes it's just a matter of talking to the stakeholders and saying what is expected rather than over-regulating. In the anxiety when you see a lot of tourists or of all types around, in the anxiety to get their attention, you often get several of these watercrafts zooming up along toward the beach, towards swimmers, zooming close to them. It can be very nerve-inducing. Environment and exercise as they compete. They're almost behaving like ZRs hustling for passengers. That really, they are the marine equivalent of the ZRs. And there is implicit in that certain dangers that may have to be monitored and so on. It may not be essential to regulate by way of legislation, but I believe that conversations with the stakeholders about behaviors which are high risk and attitudes which are not helpful may be enough, especially with those who have been in the industry for a long time and are interested in ensuring its sustainability. It may well be enough to have conversations with them alone. Water sports has long been an area in which many Black Barbadians invest. And I believe that with the increased visitor arrivals, that there is opportunity for more entrepreneurs to get involved in this sphere of activity, which has possibilities for good income earning. When we have bumper tourism seasons, when we have cricket, when we have other festivals, when we have increased airlift to Barbados as we do now, so that our numbers are exceeding the post-COVID arrivals, then the activities on the beach and the opportunities for maritime recreation increase exponentially, and therefore opens up opportunities for people to get into this sector. I would wish to encourage, insurances may be high, but I would wish to encourage young people who are looking for investment to get together with other young people, people of our ethnicity. Do not join with others to invest. We have remained suspicious of one another, intolerant of one another, disrespectful of one another, and unwilling to help and support one another, even in our own interests. But sometimes it warrants our putting our differences aside and going into joint ventures, because I alone may not have the capital, but together with you, Mr. President, sir, well, sir, you might have the capital. Sir, I may have to get together with another person whose pocket is as shallow as mine in order to create the opportunity for the investment in this or other areas, but I am willing to do so because, you know, I believe that you cannot grow wealth intergenerationally. You cannot grow wealth in the Black community. You cannot grow wealth in any community unless you really are willing to have joint ventures, cooperate on matters of business, and get your foot in the door sometimes and then go off and do your own investment. So I think that this is an opportunity with our tourism arrivals and positive projections for the coming winter, that new opportunities for investment for all Barbadians. Sir, I focus on Black entrepreneurs and the Black community because clearly I've come out of a family of entrepreneurs. I understand what entrepreneurship means, the challenges that Black entrepreneurs encounter, and it is therefore the area to which I speak, but I'm not at all suggesting that this is not an enterprise for investment by all Barbadians of any ethnic extract. It is an opportunity. I'm just trying to say to our young people, Black young people, this is an opportunity that you are not to ignore. And often they do not get encouragement to get into business, and it is important that they should do so. I want to make just a couple more points, sir, and there are these. As we speak to the issue, it is a tangential issue, but an issue nonetheless, sir. As we speak to this issue of investment in the maritime sector and potential yields from the maritime sector, I want to raise what is now becoming a major global issue and global argument of some controversy at the international level. And that is the increasing conversation around deep sea mining. I raise it because there has been much in the international newspapers on it. I raise it because the Cook Islands in the Pacific have now developed a draft deep sea mining code. It came out in the last few days, sir, and they have put it out to the public for review and comment. It is on one of their websites and is available. In a week or so, the International Seabed Authority is going to meet, headquartered in Jamaica, is going to meet not just to elect a new Secretary General, and the election really has focused around the merits or demerits of deep sea bed mining. As you know, sir, the significant thrust to obtain minerals for new and emerging technologies, particularly green technologies, has increased the search for certain minerals which are used particularly, as I said, in green technologies. And it is now being mooted that some of those minerals are available in nodules on the deep sea bed, and that they will not take much effort to extract, but are readily available to be scooped up. It is an extremely expensive, or it is anticipated to be an extremely expensive enterprise. It is certainly going to be the next area of maritime investigation, maritime exploration, maritime extraction, and maritime revenue generation, allegedly. But equally, it calls on us to consider what kinds of legislative framework, what kinds of environmental protections we need to put in place if in fact this is the direction in which the world is going. And indeed, it is the direction, it appears, in which the world is going. Commercial entities are lining up for licenses to do deep seabed mining, while on the other hand, commercial entities are lining up against it because of what they perceive or argue will be the damage, some of it irreparable, to the marine environment. I make this point because It is alleged, and I'm saying it is alleged because, sir, with something that is so new and pioneering, that has no precedence, we really do not know what the full implications will be. But it is alleged that there are potential risks for fish stocks, that there are potential risks for coral reef structures, that there are potential risks to the marine environment, on one hand. On the other, it is argued that the depths, the level of disruption, the depths, it is so, the levels of extraction taking place would be so deep, the level of disruption would be so minimal that by comparison with the disruptive mining on land, it is not likely to have the same scale of adverse impact and environmental damage. I make these arguments, sir, because more and more, because this legislation today, this issue of maritime protection lends itself to it. But more and more, this is a conversation that is coming into the international space. The New York Times has now had a few editorials and commentaries on it and on the upcoming elections that will take place in Jamaica within the next 10 days or so, sir. I think the date is around perhaps the 30th or so, if my memory serves me correctly, the 30th or so of July. Barbadians have to start to become sensitized or sensitive to what is happening in the Pacific, because those are small island developing states too. And we have to start to become aware of what is the pressures that are going to be placed on the marine environment and the decisions government are going to have to face in the management of how we use our maritime spaces. Already, there is conversation across the globe about the implications of climate change on our coastlines, and that is a conversation that will continue. It is important, sir, that we do these protections today and that people better understand why it is, therefore, the Prime Minister has been engaged at the highest international levels on this matter of climate change, because Beryl has just shown us what climate change means to a small island developing state like Barbados, to the culture, to the society, to the landscape, to the maritime environment, to livelihoods, to the economy, to the average ordinary Barbadian. So when the Prime Minister is out there fighting on the international level on issues relating to climate change, she is fighting to protect us from Beryl, to get money, to put measures in place that you reinforce your coastline, you become more resilient, you have improved infrastructure, you improve your fishing fleet. We need resources to do it. We do not have the resources ourselves, and the fight has to be made at the international level, so that people often do not appreciate that international relations is the external face of your domestic policy and your strategic national objectives. And it is therefore in pursuit of those objectives, that the national objectives, protection of the country in the fight against climate change, that the Prime Minister has mobilized at the international level. I close, sir, by making one last point, and it is this. Last year at the COP, the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which takes place annually, but which last year saw the development of a loss and damage fund, out of which vulnerable developing countries are to get financial resources to help in the very face of incidents like Beryl took place. As a government and as a people, we must ensure that that fund is capitalized and operationalized as quickly as possible. The reason being that Beryl has come at the beginning of a hurricane season that is expected to be highly active. Beryl came in July, where we know we normally get the biggest blows from August, September, October. Beryl did not give us any direct hit, not a bad hit. Beryl passed 80 miles south of Barbados. We got storm force winds. The Eastern Caribbean was hit with Category 4 hurricane force winds at 175 miles an hour, and we saw the pictures. We saw the consequences. We like to say that God is a Bajan. But I remind the chamber that God's Son had to go through great physical horrors and suffering. It is not beyond us, and it must not be beyond our imagination that a very high-strength hurricane could pass close to or directly on Barbados. And if you see what Beryl did, passing 80 miles south and hitting us only with storm force winds, can you imagine what would happen if we got a direct hit? I want, therefore, to make two appeals. To let us stop saying that the Prime Minister is traveling too much when she is traveling in the national interest, and let her do her work to protect this country against climate change. The second appeal I want to make is to Barbadians. Be prepared. People called me to complain that their water was off for just a couple hours, that their electricity was off. You think that somebody in Carriacou or Palm Island or Union Island won't be happy to switch places with us and lost water or electricity only for a couple hours? When they tell you something is coming, be prepared. Get a little money from the ATM and put one side. I say that because in Hurricane Sandy, I experienced that people because the electricity went off, ATMs were offline, cash registers were offline, and the only people who could buy food or supplies, including baby supplies, were people who actually had cash, because cards could not be used. So that we need to add that to the information we give to the public. In the same way you buy canned foods and bottled water, make sure you keep a little cash under the bed, or women always, when you rent to all-time vendors, they can always pull out something from the bosom. Wherever you're going to keep it, it is up to you, but keep a little cash in reserve during hurricane season. Whatever you can keep. Second, take the warnings to have a food supply on hand. You do not know how long an electricity system will be out. You don't know how long you would have to do without water. The warnings tell you. I have to admit, my electricity went out, and when I said to my husband, take down the kerosene lamps, he said to me, they ain't got any kerosene. So the lamps were there pretty, not a drop of kerosene. He came up, he had something with some batteries in it, and he came and he handed me one, and so we were able to have that. No, that would not have lasted, I don't think, for days. So keep your kerosene or your battery-operated devices. Make sure you can charge your phone. Make sure you have adequate water for every member of the household. That is not a bottle of water like if you're going to the beach or strolling down Broad Street. You have to have a serious supply of water. When I buy coconut water, when I wash the bottle, I wash the bottles out after, and I have bottles that had in coconut water filled with water. So when we don't have a generator, so when the electricity went out and the pump could not, even though the tank had the water, the pump couldn't supply, I had bottles and bottles of water that I could have cooked with, that I could bathe with, that I could give the dogs fresh water that I could use. When they tell you keep water, it in a little bottle, nor a little pint cup. You have to have gallons, 5 gallons for every member of your house. So see if you can get some pigtail buckets. See if you can get some other, I'm not telling you eat all the pigtails. See if you can get some containers that really can store water and cover them down properly so that mosquitoes can't breed in them and that you can use the water. Sir, I've tried to speak at the local and the household level, and I hope that these remarks have been useful in the context of the legislation today, which I support.
Thank you very much, Honourable Senator Thompson. Senator Mr. Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I think I'm a couple of years older than Senator Thompson. She reminded me of her prowess on the political platform. As she spoke just now, she was exceptionally comprehensive. In fact, I don't know if you're ready to speak again, but I will speak, sir. Sir, I am from a fishing family. I am from a fishing family on both sides. One set in St. Philip and the other set in Oistins. And I do not think that people have truly realized the level of devastation. And it is because it happened in one place. It is because we herded all the boats into one space and they were crushed. Had it happened on the home, let me call them the home ports for these boats, Barbadians in general might have seen the real devastation. I have friends and family who took boats from St. Philip and from Oistins into what they thought was safe harbor and lost them all, an act of nature. And whether the boats were insured or not, it would have happened. And Senator Thompson is right, and I don't mean to make my contribution with Senator Thompson, but she is right when she says, when she spoke with the Prime Minister, the Honourable Prime Minister has been going to international conferences like COP27, I remember that one particular, where she spoke about climate change and global warming, and the need to pay attention to what will happen to small island states, sir, when the changes continue to get worse. And I am sure that almost every child in Barbados, by the time they return to school, can write an essay on beryl. Now, sir, the impact that this, let me call it a hurricane, will have on intergenerational wealth is unseen. Often, sir, when a family has had a fishing boat, the boat didn't start, sir, with that member of the family. It usually is a boat that belonged to maybe their great-grandfather, and it has been reclassed and upgraded, and reclassed and upgraded, and then maybe they acquired a second boat and a third boat. And a father who is now too old to fish has his sons fishing and the grandfather's on the beach. And it's a whole family at that level. So when that asset is lost, it affects not only the perceived owners, but all the people connected to the boat. Sir, in the village in which I grew up, there are families that clean fish and process fish, backyard operations. They do my fish, but there's no fish for them to do. And that's all they've done for generations. So what has happened with Beryl, sir, is painful to see, but it will have a significant social impact. And I'm glad that the government is responding in the way it has been, but it means that the wider society also has to play some role in the response. Now, sir, what Beryl has done has unfortunately brought to the fore what the Prime Minister has been saying about the impact of global warming, what will happen to us all. And it means that the infrastructure that we built out at great cost in one evening has been shown to be inadequate. And it means that we have to now relook at it, redesign it, and rebuild it at frightening costs. I don't know how much it will cost. But what it means is, sir, that when we rebuild this fleet of fishing boats, if we do not have adequate infrastructure to protect them, you have to ask, what's the point of doing it? If you rebuild it and you do not have safe harbor to protect you against what you believe will come, the same thing might happen again. So when the government announces that it wants to borrow money, I think that sometimes, while we might be critical and worried about how we repay, we have to look and see whether it makes sense and whether 30 to 50 years on, it will benefit the whole country. Sir, I want to make a comment, sir, about the beaches, because lots and lots of beaches have been eroded. That's not new. Beaches come and go all the time. I have pictures I inherited from my cousin that show where there was almost no beach on Browns Beach, and the water beat against the esplanade. So beaches come and go. But sir, there's been a lot of land accretion, and people have claimed new land, and I'm pretty sure that Beryl has altered some of that. And I hope that the relevant authorities, until, well, I can't say how much has been lost. I don't know how much has been lost, but if pathways that were considered public pathways have been lost, and the law says now, sir, that you can walk a certain distance from the high tide mark, I would like to believe, sir, that the government will make sure that the public access is protected. Luckily, the boardwalk that was properly engineered, I was here at the stage, with the stage of this matter, survived. But there are places, sir, where the dirt on the East Coast has been exposed and all the sand and the rocks have moved. Senator Thompson mentioned marine discharges. And sir, I was pleased to hear when Senator Abrams said that the outlet pipe for the sewer system was re-anchored. I think he said re-anchored and secured. And it reminded us that that problem still exists. It's been out of sight and out of mind, but it still exists 6 years on, because it's not an easy fix. So while the government struggles with successes to move things along, there are outstanding problems that we only remember when something like Beryl happens, and you're reminded that there's a big outlet pipe keeping it off the roads. Now, sir, the matter of regulating the fishing industry, I suspect, is one that no government really wants to talk about, because it will mean enforcing things that some people may find painful. For example, sir, if you have a fishing fleet that has suffered over 60% damage, it means that persons have to find employment inshore. And you have to ask, what will the increased pressure caused by inshore fishing do to fish stocks? You might have less boats, but if the fishing is not concentrated inshore, will it deplete fish stocks? And I have in the past refused to buy some of the dolphins offered to me that were 5 pounds and stuff like that, because I know that they are young dolphins that are being destroyed. And it's about time, sir, that the government, if the legislation exists, they need to enforce it. And if it doesn't exist, government needs to bring it. It needs to be regulation of the sizes and species of fish that we can catch, net sizes. In the same way, sir, that many years ago, you could almost sell fish anywhere. And now you're required to sell them. You can't sell fish within a certain distance of a fish market. And we accept that. And government needs to almost hastily move to regulate the species and the sizes of fish caught, sir. Now, sir, with your leave, I want to comment on something that I heard. I heard a calypso, sir. That while the writer and the singer of the calypso, sir, might have thought it was funny, and if you're obligated to say this, he sang about the QEH. And I'm not giving him publicity. This is not giving him publicity. But I was ashamed to think that a Barbadian, sir, would stand somewhere and make such a recording when they benefited from the same system that they're abusing. There is a famous quote, sir, that said, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." I say that, sir, about him. I thank you, sir.
You, Senator Mr. Naylor. Is there no further contributions, please, Rapper? Well, Senator Dr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'll speak very briefly, just in 3 areas. First, Mr. President, I want to, as some might say, naturally, perhaps, commend the government for the legislation. Mr. President, I grew up in the Paradise Village, St. Lawrence area, very near to the beach. So very familiar with the water sports, activities of the residents, very familiar with the jet skis in the area. And the tension that happens, of course, between entrepreneurs who want to use that activity in order to make a living, and then also as well with tourists, and as we develop what that means in terms of how they operate to ensure that those who want to make a living, those young men who play their businesses on the beaches, can make sure that they operate in a way that is safe and that contributes. So I believe, Mr. President, the legislation provides, therefore, a good medium for, again, like I said, those entrepreneurs to be able to have a frame in which they are registered, Mr. President, in which there are applicable rules for them to be able to play that trade. And this is important because very often we have the view, particularly of young men as we see them on the beach. Many of them, like I said, as I grew up in the Dover area, that was the natural place, the beach, for you to be able to make a living, yeah? I can't remember, there used to be a word that we used to call them at one time. You know, the young men who used to be on the beach, don't think it was gigolos, whatever the word Bajan term that we used to use, the beach bums, and we used to call them. But very often, like I said, there were the hustlers, yeah, attempting to make a livelihood. Mr. President, I actually know a young man, again from in the Paradise Village area, who started out perhaps as a so-called beach bum and now still almost 40 years later runs a successful business on Dover Beach, Mr. President, through water sports. So that there is a pathway for those persons to be able to come into legitimate business. And then, Mr. President, as I said, to have legislation that then allows them to be able to operate in BC as legitimate businesses. I also, Mr. President, just want to comment, as I heard Senator Christopher Maynard talk about the fishing sector and the devastation by barrels. So of course, while this legislation does not necessarily speak to it, it is important, an important adjunct. Mr. President, I was on the ground, I think the same day barrel passed, as soon as right after we got the all clear, in the neighborhood throughout Scarborough, talking to fisher folk. I remember one of the fishermen was actually nearly in tears because coincidentally his boat had only been there for repairs, there being Bridgetown Fisheries Complex for repairs. So it actually hadn't been moved as part of the safe harbor. But about 2 weeks ago, the boat was there for repairs. He lost his boat. His mother lost her boat. His sister as well lost the boat. A whole family that depended on fishing. And those were the stories that we continue to hear. In Oystins in particular as well. Watching the jetty, the damage to the jetty, talking to even those who ply their trade there, seeing the damage there, and also just even when we talk about the beach erosion. We had several, I think it was almost 3 or 4 feet of sand that moved from the beach area and found itself right up to the top of the Bay Gardens area. And then having to undertake the operation to be able to make sure that we push that sand back. And the considerations as well, what do we do with the sand? How do we make sure that we can return the beach to the best state? And then also as well, even discussions, knowing what was happening on the West Coast. Is it now that we need to move some of the sand from the South Coast to the West Coast to help us to be able to repair? What happens as well to all the debris? And Mr. President, one of the things that I was shocked about, and this is something that we have to watch, is the level of pollution. All of the drains there were blocked, Mr. President, by bottles. Plastic bottles washing up from the beach, containers, styrofoam containers. I mean, thousands upon thousands of little pieces of styrofoam containers washing up on the beach, right up, again, into Bay Gardens, Mr. President. And we see that, and we are responsible for that level of pollution and damage. And then the other question is also about the level of technical resource that we can bring together to be able to address the problems, again, damage to the reef, damage to the beach, Mr. President, the level of beach erosion, and the extent to which all of those resources will be available within a short space of time to help us to be able to rebuild. And I think, Mr. President, that this is one of the areas that certainly the government is looking to make sure that we have a pool of technical resources that can easily and very quickly be mobilized in order to be able to address situations. Certainly in Oystins, Mr. President, as I traversed that area, and when the Prime Minister came, we were able to bring together resource, again, from the NCC, Mr. President. We were able to make sure that we had resources from MTW, from the Water Authority. We brought technical resources from Coastal as well, Mr. President, in order to look and make sure that we have a holistic frame in order to be able to make sure that we could help the fisher folk and as well as those that were operating their businesses there to inform them of the best solution and the way forward. But this is something that we have to be able to be cognizant of, and I believe, as Senator Maynard would have indicated, it is something, and when I say something about planning forward and understanding that for government, that there are going to be hard choices that have to be made when we face such instances, when we face such disasters. And therefore, one of the quick things that the government had to do, Mr. President, was to be able to make sure that we had a proper estimate of the damage. Because it was not just a matter of rationing and saying this is what we're going to do and put resources there, unless we knew what was the scale of the impact. And that is why we spent a couple of days to just make sure that we understood what was damaged, what needed to be repaired, speaking to experts, Mr. President, so that we could be assured that we understood all facets and dimensions of the problem. And then coming up with a full suite of actions in order to be able to address. If we look at what the Prime Minister and the government announced in relation to assisting the fisher folk to be able to recover from that. Mr. President, we had the establishment of a benevolent fund for fisher folk that would be financed by a donation or not a loan from the CAF facility of US $250,000. And the government, even though that came as a donation to help generally, the government determined that it was going to put all of those resources to the aid of the fisher folk to establish that benevolent fund. During COVID, we established a business interruption benefit. And that business interruption benefit allowed, again, for small business people, entrepreneurs, again, who would not have had an income during COVID to be able to make sure that they had some resources. And Mr. President, what we also did was to make sure, again, that fisher folk, particularly those who were paying into the NIS, could also have access to this business interruption benefit so that over the period and until they were able to get back on their feet, again, that they will have some resources. But we didn't stop there. The government has also established a 30-year revolving fund, Mr. President, a 30-year revolving fund. And that fund, Mr. President, will assist with the financing for boat repairs and purchases of new vessels, with government offering separate grants of up to 25% of the cost to make sure that there is access to financing, and therefore that we can assist, again, those boat owners to be able to have the resources as well. But we also understand, as we've been discussing here, and as the Deputy President would have indicated, the wider discussion is placed within the context of climate change and its impact. And therefore, the government also announced plans to make sure that it addressed the long-term issue of coastal repair and climate mitigation. And therefore, Mr. President, up to, I think it was last week, we had an almost 2 or 3 hour presentation, again, by members of the Coastal Zone Unit, by technical experts that were brought in to be able to look holistically, again, at what is the long-term, not 5-year plan, not 10-year plan, not even 20-year plan. What does a 30-year plan look like when it comes, Mr. President, to be able to make sure that we can address the issues of coastal zone management and protection, to make sure that our fisher folk in the event, Mr. President, of now a Category 5 hurricane. We're not even building now for a Category 4, but a Category 5 hurricane, Mr. President. We'll be able to have the best infrastructure that can offer for protection. And that is the level of investment that the government is intended to make to ensure the livelihoods. Again, because we understand that when we talk about the fishing sector, we're talking about, as we've said in here, Mr. President, ordinary Barbadians and their livelihoods, Mr. President. Mr. President, finally, I also want to indicate as well that in respect of the bill before us, that one of the fundamental things that I think that is important, again, and I come back to that issue of how we deal with the so-called working or small man within society, and the extent to which government has to be able to balance regulation and freedom in terms of the operations that we have, is that government has to be able to facilitate, and that while there may be a call or an impetus to always think that government has to step in with a heavy hand to regulate every single aspect of what is happening, that we must allow for the market and competition and for consumers to be able to exercise their rights, to be able to exercise some level of responsibility as well within the market and within the operations. My final call, Mr. President, because I heard, again, a deputy president speak to the issue of people calling and saying that their water was out, just after a couple of hours. Mr. President, I want to urge Barbadians, my final thing, urge Barbadians that we must make sure that we conserve water, Mr. President. Mr. President, we must make sure that we conserve water at the individual level. Mr. President, in 2020, Barbados was at 80%, not almost, at 88% of its extraction capacity of our underground water supplies. 88% in 2020. I don't want to tell you, Mr. President, where we are now in 2024. We are almost at the exhaustion point, Mr. President. And therefore, if we do not take individual responsibility for the resource, again, in the event of another hurricane, we have to ask ourselves, what happens? With those few words, Mr. President, I commend this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Moroni. Senator Andrew Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do not wish to detain the chamber very long, but I thought it important to enter this debate not only as a boy who spent many a Sunday morning on the beaches of Oistins roasting fish with my family, or who very much enjoys swimming on the west coast of Barbados, but also as a person with a disability. The bill speaks extensively to the training that is likely to come attendant to the regime that the government is creating. And I say I'm going to be brief because I really intend to make perhaps two calls. The first of them being that as the government establishes the expanded regime for the training of persons in the marine sector, that it include persons with disabilities. As you know, sir, the government of Barbados is contemplating the improvement of the lives of persons with disabilities, and a critical component of that improvement is the expansion of employment opportunities. We are trying to beat back the devastating statistic of 90% of persons with disabilities being unemployed in this country. And This bill and the regime that is to come, sir, creates an opportunity for the government of Barbados to put its money where its mouth is and to make good on the commitment as it proposes to ask members of the private sector to do a similar thing. Senator Cummins, in her earlier comments, referred to the Marine Authority and the training that entity will provide to ensure that persons who participate in the sector, whether they be water sports operators or any other kind, that they are appropriately trained. I ask that persons with disabilities are appropriately considered in that training and that we make real efforts. Because I think one of the things that annoys me just slightly, doing this work around engaging with members of the private sector and others around the employment of persons with disabilities, is that I think they unnecessarily and unduly wring their hands about where they're going to get persons with disabilities to hire from. And I find it, I find it slightly annoying. I also find it slightly amusing because they don't necessarily wring their hands about where they're going to get customers from. And so I think that there has to be some real effort in attracting persons with disabilities to participate in this sector. The Honorable Deputy President spoke about the extent to which the sector is a viable one for investment and participation by Barbadians, and that, Mr. President, should include persons with disabilities. And so I call on the entities, the relevant entities, to ensure that as we build out, this expands and seek to expand the capacity in the sector, that we include these individuals who, as I have said in this chamber before, have the capacity and the acumen and certainly the desire to contribute not only to the development of themselves, but to the development of this country. My other point, sir, is almost tangential to that, and it is the accessibility of the marine environment for persons with disabilities. As we build and perhaps rebuild in the wake of Beryl beach facilities, and we restore our beaches, we must ensure that they're accessible to persons with disabilities. And that means in a very real way that the facilities that we build, whether they be the bathroom facilities, whether they be the stairs that lead the stairs, and I'm encouraging the consideration of things like ramps and other universally designed facilities to ensure that persons with disabilities have the ability to enjoy what so many of us, so many of you take for granted, the ability to, hop out of your car on an afternoon and take a dip in the sea if that is what you choose to do. And I think that that too has to be as we improve infrastructure, we have to ensure that recreation and that social activity is also available to persons with disabilities. I regrettably say often that if you are a person with a disability in this country, you go to school if you're lucky enough to, you go to church if you're inclined to, but for too long we have lived in a society where the festivities and social interactions are not accessible to you. And I say that as the country marks 50 years of crop over, and I know that we can do better, and I encourage us so to do. Mr. President, I wish to commend this bill to the Chamber, to commend the government for the work that they're doing, even in light of those two calls. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Anthony Boyce. Senator Cummings, please rise.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Again, as usual, I am very appreciative to the honourable senators, all of whom have spoken. Senator Malalu, when he opened the batting in his comments, I expressed appreciation for them, and I draw his attention to sections, the clauses 182 through 188, I believe it is, which speaks to the regime governing not just owners, I know you mentioned the owners, but the regime governing operators and members of crew, speaking to the responsibilities assigned to the crew and those who are boat masters. So there are certain obligations that are assigned to the owners of the vessels, but those who are operating them, who, as you have quite right, as Senator Malalu has quite rightly said, may be renting them, may be operating them on behalf of an owner, they have assigned responsibilities that are outlined in the legislation. As I mentioned, Articles 82 speak to, Article 8, Clause 82 speaks to duties of boat masters. The Clause 183 speaks about what happens after a collision of any kind, the duty to render assistance. Section 185, Clause 185 speaks to the duty of an operator in this instance, and then you talk about the duty of the crew all the way through 189. So there are a number of things which are captured there, covering a number of scenarios and the conduct. There are also measures, as I mentioned, which are captured in the regulations that speak to the code of conduct and the standards of conduct that are required for persons that fall in these categories, and those fall under the remit of the minister's regulations, which would be appended to this legislation. So those are all important points which have been raised by the honourable senator, and they are captured in the legislation as previously outlined. But in instances where they're not captured in the legislation, I give the assurance that the government that I belong to, that is comprehensive and holistic in its management and treatment of issues, either would have captured it in correlated piece of legislation which has consequential relationships to this piece of legislation, or you can expect that it will come in the maritime suite of legislation and regulations that we have referred to. Senator, the Honourable or Deputy President, in her own extensive comments, I believe, spoke about the relationship between our global interactions and representations on behalf of Barbados, and then how that impacts us locally. In speaking about the work that is being done by our Honourable Prime Minister and travelling, and speaking about the issues relating to climate and how that is connected to Beryl, Mr. President, the Honourable Deputy President has been a little bit modest, because what she has not done is that she has not shared with the Honourable Chamber that she is the country's representative on the all-important body for Loss and Damage Fund. And the Loss and Damage Fund is examining how to treat to climate events and how to treat to capitalizing the Loss and Damage Fund, and how countries like us can take advantage of the provisions that are captured there under the identical circumstances where a weather event, an extreme weather event occasioned by the climate crisis as it evolves, affects countries like Barbados. What the Honourable Deputy President has also not said about her own self and her own work on behalf of the country and on behalf of the Prime Minister is the work that has been done for Bridgetown Initiative in its first incarnation, Bridgetown Initiative 2.0. The Prime Minister has just launched Bridgetown Initiative 3.0 in Antigua at the SIDS conference, and it is the funding mechanisms in the first instance, the response mechanisms after a hurricane system or a weather system of any kind has passed. Those are the kinds of things that Barbados cannot navigate in the local space on its own, and they must take advantage of the skills, the competence, and the vision of our Prime Minister and those that she has appointed to represent us in the global space to ensure that when these things happen to countries like Barbados, there are mechanisms that allow us, one, to respond immediately post a disaster, Two, to be able to finance, Senator Maynard in his comments when he spoke about rebuilding infrastructure, to finance the building in the first instance of climate resilient infrastructure, so that the 1 in 100 year storms, even when they become 1 in 20, 1 in 30 or 35 year storms, that our infrastructure is rebuilt, and that the financing mechanisms that are available to countries like ours reflect the fact that we do not have the kind of fiscal space that large advanced economies have available to them. And I want to make this appeal as well to our people. There is a political agenda in this country where people are attempting to make everything that the government does for people about something other than what it is. When the government goes to financial institutions for loans to build infrastructure, it is to respond to the kinds of things that Senator Maynard has spoken about in terms of having infrastructure that is fit for purpose. Infrastructure that in some instances is 30 years old, 50 years old, even 20 years old, can no longer be fit for purpose when we see with our own two eyes what happened along our coastlines with Beryl. On the west coast of Barbados, I can say, Mr. President, that Senator Malalou, when he spoke about what has happened, and you've heard our Prime Minister speak about the 5, the 6, and in some instances, even a deeper drop along our entire west coast, and we saw what happened in the Bridgetown Fisheries Complex and up on the Oysters area. Mr. President, our coastal infrastructure is critical. So when you hear the Prime Minister and the government speaking about the creation of an expanded regime for the Coastal Zone Management Unit, for the Coastal Zone Management Unit that has for decades managed well what our coastlines are doing, and the engagement with entities like the Coastal Zone Management Unit globally, and that there is a need for us to further expand that work. These are the reasons why, Mr. President, because the same people that would wish to incite the country against the government borrowing, the government isn't doing this, the government isn't doing that, are the same people who would say the government should have done if we did not do. And so this government cannot pay attention to the theatrics of those that want to take the country down a line that is not in our best interest. We have to govern for people. We have to govern for a country that is facing unique challenges that it did not face 10 years ago, perhaps. Now, Mr. President, I want to also just make brief reference to the fact that during a weather system, electricity may go, the water may go, and at this point, Mr. President, as I speak, in today's newspaper of the Jamaica Observer, there is a protest taking place in Jamaica right now, at least more than one. 2 weeks later, after Beryl, several communities still don't have electricity, Mr. President. 2 weeks after the fact. And so they want light and they want water. 2 weeks, Mr. President. 2 weeks. After 2 hours, you had people who were being very unhappy and expressing their resentment over not having water after a Category 4 hurricane passed south of Barbados and caused the kind of damage that we had. Mr. President, I want to urge Barbadians. We spend a lot of time on social media. We spend a lot of time looking at some of these sites. And these sites, I am certain, are showing us all the images of the damage in different countries. In a previous conversation, Mr. President, in this very chamber, I used this phrase, "There but for the grace of God, go us." That could have been Barbados, and I say it could have been Barbados even as I not would, because my next statement, Mr. President, is that we are just in July. When Beryl formed off of Barbados, we were still in June, and the Met officials have said there are 23 or 25 named storms for the year, 5 of which will become major hurricanes. We have only just begun. And so what we did not do for Beryl in terms of preparation, if we haven't yet wrapped our minds around what a storm can look like for this country, we had Elsa. Before Elsa, we had Tomas. We had a freak storm in between there. Now we have had Beryl, and we've seen what they have all done throughout the region. If we have not yet wrapped our minds around the reality of what a storm can do to our island, Mr. President, this is the time for us to do it. It is now. And I want, in closing, Mr. President, to recognize the work being done by those relief officials who have left our island and who have joined our sisters and brothers in neighboring islands as part of the relief efforts and the recovery efforts. I want to, in particular, draw attention to the officials of all the regional disaster agencies, SEDEMA, and so on. But throughout the storm, Mr. President, in Barbados, you would have heard from our utility, our electric utility, that we had around 25 to 27% of our local population losing electricity during the storm. Within 3 days, we were at 100% of our customers restored, but within a day and a half, we were down to about 7 to 8% without power, and they were able to close that. But that was not, Mr. President, without them simultaneously sending crews as soon as they could to Grenada, to St. Vincent. Right now, they are helping to restore electricity in Carriacou. They're living in tents, and they had to await temporary living arrangements to be made so that they could move over from the mainland to the islands to be able to restore the electricity supply. These are Barbadians from the Coast Guard, from the Light and Power, from SEDEMA, from every possible agency who have come and they have stood up and answered the call of our brothers and sisters, Mr. President, and I want to recognize them. In closing, Mr. President, I want to align myself also with the comments made by Senator Andrele Boyce. He spoke well about the need for us to incorporate persons with disabilities in our consideration of legislation such as this and in the rebuilding efforts for infrastructure as we contemplate the engagement of persons who, just like all other Barbadians, persons with disabilities want to be able to become one with their environment, to be able to enjoy the ocean. I belong to a Rotary Club, Mr. President, that many, many years ago would have donated sea wheelchairs to the National Disabilities Unit so that persons were able, from the disabilities community, from the disabled community, to go into the water and to enjoy the water, having access to a sea wheelchair. Those are the kinds of initiatives in this instance, Mr. President, that I want, beyond what Senator Boyce, Andrele Boyce in this instance has called for, that I want to also call on our service community and our charitable communities to continue to invest in as we bring our disabled community rightfully where they belong into the maritime space, as has been raised by Senator Boyce. And it is on this basis, Mr. President, that I would wish to beg that this bill now be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do not leave the chair and the Senate resolves itself into committee for further deliberation of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honorable the Senate resolve itself in a committee for further consideration of this bill. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Honourable Senate is now in committee.
Madam Chair, will we take the bill in parts?
Permission granted.
Part 1, clauses 1 to 6.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 1, clauses 1 through 6 do now stand part.
I just wish to confirm from the clerk that taking the bill in parts does not prohibit any member from speaking on it.
No, you can speak on any section you want, any clause within it.
Thank you very much. The question is that Part 1 now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 7 to 12.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 2, clauses 7 through 12 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 2, clauses 7 through 12 now stand part. No honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 13 to 26. Sorry, 28.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause part 3, clauses 13 through 28 do now stand part.
The question is that part 3, clauses 13 through 28 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 29 to 83.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that part 4, clauses 29 through 83 do now stand part.
The question is that part 4, clauses 29 through 83 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye?
Aye.
Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 5, clauses 84 to 114.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that part 5, clauses 84 through 114 do now stand part.
The question is that part 5, sections 84, clauses 84 through 114 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 6, clauses 115 to 164.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that part 6, clauses 115 through 164 do now stand part.
The question is that part 6, clauses 115 to 164 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 7, clauses 165 to 177.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that part 7, clauses 165 through 177 do now stand part.
The question is that part 7, clauses 165 through 177 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Will all honorable senators against please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 8, clauses 178 to 191.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that part 8, clauses 178 through 191 do now stand part.
The question is that part 8, clauses 178 to 191 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. All honorable senators against please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 9, clauses 192 to 201.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that part 9, clauses 192 through 2201 do now stand part.
The question is that part 9, clauses 192 through 201 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 10, clauses 202 to 214.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that part 10, clauses 202 to 214 do now stand part.
The question is that part 10, clauses 202 to 214 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 11, clauses 215 to 246.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 11, clauses 215 through 246 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 11, clauses 215 to 246 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 12, clauses 247 to 259.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 12, clauses 247 through 259 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 12, clauses 247 to 259 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 13, clauses 260 to 279.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 13, clauses 260 to 279 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 13, clauses 260 to 279 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 14, clauses 280 to 293.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 14, clauses 280 to 293 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 14, clauses 280 to 293 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 15, clauses 294 to 309. I beg your pardon, my copy. To clauses 310.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 15, clauses 294 to 310 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 15, clauses 294 to 310 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The first schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill.
The question is that the first schedule be now the first schedule to the bill. All honourable senators in favour please say aye. Aye. All honourable senators against please say no. The ayes have it.
The second schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be now the second schedule to the bill. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The third schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill.
The question is that the third schedule be now the third schedule to the bill. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. All honourable senators in favour, would you please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Being the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Shipping Domestic Vessels Act 2024.
The question is that this bill be now passed and be cited as the Shipping Domestic Vessels Act 2024. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 5, sir, which has been assigned to Senator, the Honourable Dr. Monroe Knight, to move the passing of a resolution to approve, in accordance with Section 2 of the Special Loans Act, Chapter 105, the borrowing of up to US dollars, $12,400,000 from the CARICOM Development Fund to co-finance and augment the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle for the climate resilient wastewater systems project on the terms and conditions contained in the loan agreement, the main provisions of which are set out in the schedule.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me as I stand to lead debate on this resolution. Mr. President, in our previous debate, we would have touched on the issue of climate change and its impact, the work of the government, particularly that of our Prime Minister, as well as the work that's being done to increase the global awareness in the context of our Bridgestone initiative, Bridgestone 3.0 as it stands. And this particular resolution, as we've heard, and I will repeat again, is a resolution to facilitate the co-financing of a project called the 3 R's. 3 R's standing for Reduce, Reuse, Recycle, Climate Resilience Wastewater Systems Project. And we call that the 3R Cruise project, Mr. President, in Barbados. There was funding provided by the Green Climate Fund, or the GCF, for US $40 million, but it was a grant, Mr. President. It was a grant. And I want to make that clear. We're seeking to borrow this $12.4 million, yes, from the CARICOM Development Fund to supplement grant financing that was provided previously by GCF. And that is an important point, Mr. President, I want to be able to make. The CARICOM Development Fund was established under the Treaty of Chaguaramas. It was established under Article 158 for the purpose of providing technical assistance to disadvantaged countries, regions, and sectors, Mr. President. And this fund, if we look at the last financial report that the fund would have put out and is available publicly online, again, Mr. President, reiterating there's no need for public servants to assist. You can go online, Google it, and you'll be able to pull up that report. And it shows that the activities of this CARICOM Development Fund has been to provide support in a number of critical areas related to the development of the region. In particular, Mr. President, they would have provided funding for education initiatives. They would have provided funding for infrastructure initiatives, for instant kits, for instance, for Frigate Bay, and a number of other areas, even for environmental and sustainability studies, and therefore funding for the water sector in Barbados falls directly within the remit of this CARICOM Development Fund. I also want to indicate that outside of this funding, the government is also seeking to engage the CDF to provide technical resource assistance as well, Mr. President, because we recognize that the issues in relation to water, building water infrastructure are complex over a number of different years. We are dealing with aging infrastructure from the 1800s, right? From the 1800s, aging infrastructure from the 1800s. And these are problems and challenges that have bedeviled various administrations. So the government is not only going to the CDF for funding to say, give us some financial resources as well, but also for the provision of technical resources as we seek to create a comprehensive frame to address some of the challenges facing the water sector. Mr. President, I hope that we can all agree that, again, that the challenge of the water sector is, as I said before, complex and multifold. But it is not only a challenge for Barbados, it is a regional challenge. And so that while Barbados has been identified as one of the 15th water scarce countries, right across the region, you are seeing country after country being faced with this challenge. As a matter of fact, a study that was done in May 2024 by the University of Maryland suggests that the whole of the region, the entire Caribbean, is facing a water crisis. It identified that in Trinidad and Tobago, up to the end of June, there were restrictions on water use, fines being applied. It showed, again, similar occurrences in Dominica and in Grenada, Mr. President, in St. Lucia. So right across the region, we are seeing all of us grappling with this challenge of climate, of the water crisis. And while that study identified several reasons for the challenges related to water, one of the areas that identified quite solidly was the challenge that had to do with climate, And we know that there are two kinds of threats to water when we talk about climate. One has to do with the challenge for infrastructure when you have a major hurricane or a major climatic event. In fact, that study said to us that when we had Hurricane Thomas in 2010, it cost the government over $20 million in infrastructure damage to pipes, Mr. President. It means Hurricane Dorian in Grand Bahama, 54 million. And that is only, Mr. President, specifically, I'm talking here now, of the infrastructural damage. Hurricane Ivan, 3.25 million. Hurricane Irma and Maria, $700 to $800 million in infrastructural damage, water infrastructural damage. So that's one level of damage that happens due to climatic events, but also as well, our vulnerability in relation to our ability to continue to supply water as well to our population is also as well threatened, Mr. President, by changing climate as well. So the impact of drought, Mr. President, the impact of floods, Mr. President, I think we talked about it before when we were talking about the Blue-Green Development Bank, in that now we're not only seeing extreme heat, but also as well sudden bursts of rain. And again, the population will think more rain, more water, but that is not the case, Mr. President. That is not the case. Very often, that water runs off. Mr. President, that flooding can cause saltwater intrusion and a number of different negative impacts. So as opposed to thinking that the more rain, so the more water we have, Mr. President, the opposite actually happens. And therefore, the government's attempt to make sure that we address systematically and as comprehensively as possible the challenge to the water sector becomes extremely critical, Mr. President. I know, Mr. President, that some will ask, again, why is government borrowing money? First, Mr. President, I want to say that this loan has a fixed interest rate of 3% per annum, fixed interest rate, percent of 3 per annum. The CDF is a regional mechanism, like I said before and described, that provides this level of support. And so you have to ask ourselves, if we had to go on the international market for this funding, we would have been facing a much higher interest rate. We're paying 3%, Mr. President. The loan is to be repaid over 12 years. We have a 2-year grace period, so we are essentially paying over 10 years. The repayments are done quarterly, Mr. President, under this facility, and we believe that it provides the best case scenario for us to be able to co-finance the activities for the water sector, Mr. President. I also want to say, Mr. President, and I know that I might get into some trouble for this, but I think it still has to be said. Right now, we have a challenge within the Barbados Water Authority that customers are just not paying their bills. That's the fact. So that over this first quarter of 2024, we've actually seen an increase in receivables, customers not paying their bill. And I know, Mr. President, some customers may say, why should I pay for what they may see as poor service, brown water, and everything else? But then we have to ask ourselves about that chicken and the egg, Mr. President. So if you don't pay your bills, then the Water Authority does not have income then to be able then to build out the infrastructure that it needs to in order to provide better service. Presently, the Barbados Water Authority is able to collect monies that helps it to address 96% of its overheads. But then it does not leave then additional resources for reinvestment and upgrades that are needed, as I said before, to address this aging infrastructure that we have that still remains on the island from the 1800s. And therefore, it is important, Mr. President, that customers are able to pay their bills, please. That is one of the pleas that I'm going to make, Mr. President, as I stand on my feet, because then it will enable the Barbados Water Authority to be in a better financial position. Because without that, it means that it is, like I said before, not in a position to go on its own as a viable entity in order to be able to borrow monies. So the government then still has to continue to support the Barbados Water Authority and then to be able to attract loans and grants. But Mr. President, I want to say that while we are taking this loan, this 12.4 million through the CDF, I want again to reiterate it is complemented by a $4 million grant. 40 million, thank you very much. 40 million grant. And that is not the only grant. It is one of 2 grants from the GCF that the government has taken to allow it to address specifically issues within the water sector, Mr. President. I also want to say, because there's always issues of transparency and accountability and what is the grant supposed to do and the monies and all of that, I want to invite any Barbadian, all you have to do is have a little internet connection, and you can just type in the words GCF, you don't even have to spell it out, GCF, and put in 3 R's, 3R, that's all. And when you do that, you will be able actually to access the full grant, the full application that Barbados would have made for this particular grant and see the full details, Mr. President, from when we would have submitted for the initial concept right down to the full application. You will be able to see all of the details. If as well you go on the CARICOM site, again, I put in those 3 words, you will see again details of it. If you go as well on the site, there is another partner who we have partnered with in order to be able to implement this project, which is the 5 Cs, Mr. President, the Caribbean Community, struggling to remember the acronym, the 5 Cs, Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Again, if you go on that website, you will also see details, Mr. President, of this project. Again, and all the details of what the project is supposed to do. And you will find that project, Mr. President, like I said, on the CARICOM website, on the 5Cs website, because the intention, again, is that we will use this project. Barbados, the 5Cs, will use the implementation of this project to create a frame of lessons learned that can be applied right across the region, and not only in the region, not only in the Caribbean region as well, but across other small island developing states as a way for countries to manage that problem that we are all facing that has to do with making sure that we can provide adequate sources of water to our populations. Mr. President, I want, with your indulgence, please, to speak to the components of the project. The project has 4 components. Component 1 involves installing a centralized Bridgetown sewage treatment plant, but more importantly, bringing that plant up to tertiary treatment level, Mr. President. Tertiary treatment level, which is important. So this is the highest level of treatment in which now you are getting water now that is purified. It removes the contaminants, Mr. President, from the water. So you have primary, secondary, and this project is now bringing that plant up to tertiary treatment level. One component. The second component, Mr. President, again, because it has to do with climate resilience, is about the installation of a renewable photovoltaic energy system, Mr. President. That's the second component. The third component as well has to do with enhancing the capacity of technical personnel. Again, so that's the providing that technical assistance to make sure that the staff of the Barbados Water Authority can apply all of the technology that it needs to in respect of this. Component 4 as well is about education and building awareness, Mr. President, of Barbadians and of visitors as well, which is extremely important. We talked about it before, the need for all of us as a society to take responsibility for ensuring that we can conserve our water, Mr. President, and not only for hazards, but we need to do it every single day, Mr. President. As I said previously, we are near 100% abstraction of our freshwater resource. Near 100%. And that is why we are 15th water scarce or water stress, Mr. President. That is what it means. So it is a responsibility for us to be able to make sure that we can, as we did, our grandmothers and elders used to encourage us to store water, and I'm not so sure where that has gone, Mr. President. That practice of filling up the waters, don't throw away the bottles, and making sure that we have water. And for me, I grew up, and it was a year-long, Mr. President, practice. It wasn't only when we were having adverse weather. You did more of it. You ensured it. But you never throw away a bottle. You always keep a bottle with water. And so part of this project is also about doing education as well for the community, for Barbadians to understand, as well, particularly in relation to wastewater. So that's the entire project, the elements of the entire project. But specifically, this loan that we will take will provide for, Mr. President, the installation of 9 kilometers of pipeline to transport treated wastewater to lands at Waterford and Lear's Plantation, Mr. President. And then, as well, to create a 0.65 kilometer of pipeline to replace the sewage force main from the River Road lift station to the Bridgetown sewage treatment plant as well. And, Mr. President, it is important as well for us to understand. Right now, the large majority of our water resources go to domestic use and agriculture. In fact, agriculture, I am told, uses between 8 and 10 million imperial gallons of water daily. Daily, 8 and 10 million imperial gallons of water daily. So that this project it's important for us as well to continue to make sure that we can have an alternate resource for our agricultural sector and therefore as well ensure food security, Mr. President. And that is important. That is important, again, for a water-scarce island. So that the importance of this project is not just about, yes, the government is borrowing money to deal with this big problem of water, but it has implications for our ability to feed ourselves, Mr. President. It has implications for us to be able to provide water and access to water for citizens. And therefore, the context for the government going after the additional support to co-finance what we already have then becomes extremely critical, Mr. President. I also want to indicate as well that this is not the only way that the government is intended to look at addressing the challenges that are facing the water sector. Because again, some might say, you know, there's so many challenges, this is just a drop in the bucket. Will the $12.4 million do it? Will the GCF funds do it? What else is the government doing? Mr. President, the government is looking to make sure that we apply the highest level of technology in order to be able to look to address the problems, but also as well to allow us to be able to forecast. Currently, the government is partnering with Google X, Mr. President, and Google X is a high-tech company, and they function particularly to look at critical challenges that governments have and then to come up with innovative solutions, some of them custom-made and some of them that have already been applied and then will be adapted. And we're doing two things with Google X in relation to the water sector. One is seeking to develop, Mr. President, a technology in which we can use robotics to be able to go into the pipelines and allow the Barbados Water Authority to detect burst mains at the point. So it means then that we should not have to wait for customers to call in and say, there's a burst main here and there's a burst main there, but that we'll be able to apply robotics throughout the system so that we can see beforehand where those burst mains are going to be. And the second application is to be able to very quickly identify contaminants in the water, Mr. President. So seeking, again, to make sure, as I said, that we apply a number of different layers to looking at addressing the multifold and complex challenges facing the water sector. At the same time, Mr. President, we're also seeking to address the institutional challenges of the Barbados Water Authority. As I said before, we have an institution, again, able now to just cover 96% of its overheads, but in need of investments, in need of upgrades. But importantly, we understand that we have to do that by also addressing the issues of leadership and management and how do we build capacity within the institution. And that is why the government is investing in training. We have partnered with the SJPI in order to be able to train and retrain plumbers, Mr. President. We are going to partner with the government's own construction gateway to make sure that we provide an ongoing portal for training. We are investing, Mr. President, in providing coaching and mentoring for management staff, Mr. President. The government has recently signed an MOU with the government of the Netherlands that will see technical assistance exchanges coming, again, so that we will have a core group looking systematically at all of the technical challenges within the Barbados Water Authority and then bringing the two groups together in the Netherlands on the one end, also as well bringing in the University of the West Indies as well as a critical partner, and then the Barbados Water Authority to develop a long-term plan. Mr. President, we are also looking at applying geospatial technology to be able to map where the water resources are, Mr. President, for the long term. The questions that we are asking at the Barbados Water Authority, again, are not questions for today, but questions about what will happen over the next 10 or 20 years? Where will we have the greatest fault lines, Mr. President? What will happen to our wells, Mr. President? What do we need to do with our abstraction wells, Mr. President? We're asking questions, Mr. President, what will happen at our pumping stations? Which ones are the ones that will more likely go down quickly and why? And how do we forecast? So, Mr. President, these are not things that will happen overnight. It will not happen overnight. And so we ask customers, and we are all customers, Mr. President. I remember one time I was to attend an important meeting. I think the portfolio had not too long come into Prime Minister's office, and I was getting ready to go to my very important meeting at which I was supposed to speak. Mr. President, I went in the bathroom and there was no water. And I'm calling the Barbados Water Authority, who promised faithfully, all right, hold on, don't go away. We can get your water on and we can send a tanker. Mr. President, an hour later, I was still without water and I had to resort to, where's got a little bath, he's got normally little bottles and stuff like that. I had to resort to a cowboy. I had to resort to a good cowboy, Mr. President, to make sure that I was able to get to my event. I had to call and apologize. I had to call and apologize to the people that I was going to speak to, but I got there with my cowboy bath, Mr. President. So saying that we are all customers, so begging the Barbadian public to be patient as the Barbados Water Authority works through some of the complex issues that are facing the authority, but also given the assurance that we are working in order to be able to address those persistent issues that have been plaguing the Water Authority for a number of years. And one of the areas, Mr. President, again, that we will be focusing on is making sure that we can, one, like I said before, do the education and awareness. And there are two big initiatives that you will see the government roll out over this year into 2025. And one of those areas is that of the establishment of a water academy. And the Prime Minister would have spoken to this already. And we are engaged in these discussions in terms of how we can make sure that we can have this water academy established. And why the importance of this water academy, Mr. President? Because the problem is not just a Barbados problem. As I said before, it's a regional problem, it's a SIDS problem, it's a global problem. And how we work together in order to be able to address those problems is something that Barbados is intended to take leadership on, Mr. President, and ownership on. Because we recognize that, again, while people may talk about it, the impact is going to be such that the government needs to take a full handle of this. And so that we are engaged right now in discussions to see how we can make sure that we can have a water academy, one, that we establish to make sure that we bring all of the best technical resource to bear to deal with the issues, but also as well provide the necessary education and pathways to build the human resource capacity that will be needed, including making pathways for new jobs in the areas, Mr. President, because right now, that is also one of the challenges that we are facing, that we do not have all of the technical capacity that we need here on the island in order, again, to deal with the complexity of the task that we are facing. And we want to make sure that we can build that capacity. So while that is long-term, in the short term, over the summer, the Barbados Water Authority is intended to partner with the Barbados Community College over their summer program and make sure that we can include in that curriculum information on water saving, Mr. President, how to conserve, rainwater harvesting, etc., so that we can begin to build awareness within the community, and particularly first, starting with young people as well, on the issue of water and how to conserve water. And we will roll that out to a number of schools. Once schools start again in September, there will be a massive campaign, Mr. President, that we will undertake in schools throughout the island in order, like I said before, to ensure that there is the necessary education. Mr. President, as I close and as I commend this resolution for the borrowing of this money from the CARICOM Development Fund to this honorable chamber, again, I want to say that we must fully contend with the challenge of how do we manage, how do we adapt to the impact of climate change? How do we make sure that we have all the necessary resources to manage effectively for our populations? Because as government, we cannot, Mr. President, step back. We cannot step back from that responsibility. And therefore, it is important for us to be able to make sure that we can bring the necessary resources, Mr. President. I also want to indicate, Mr. President, I'm sure that as I did when we were discussing the Blue-Green Development Bank, that the level of resources for states like ours, concessional resources, grants, and other financing, to be able to address these issues is extremely small to negligent. This is why the Deputy Speaker has to be going to the Loss and Damage Fund meetings to continue to fight, because even though they agree to establish it, it is still a fight to make sure that the resources are there and available. So the pot of resources, in order for us to be able to do it, Mr. President, is shrinking and it is small. The same resources at the domestic level that we collect through taxes, Mr. President, we have to deal with schools and roads and everything else. So that the borrowing of these funds to supplement, to provide as co-financing, Mr. President, is really an imperative for the government as we seek to address these challenges, and particularly to make sure that we can continue to provide water for citizens that is safe and reliable. I'm obliged, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Cheryl Mondoro-Knight. Senator Mr. Maynard.
Mr. President, I do not wish to delay the chamber, but I wish to say one thing. I have heard no mention, sir, of the use of our cisterns in the houses. And I would like the government, sir, to start a campaign of education, sir, to educate the public on how to use the water in the cisterns and maybe introduce green plumbing. I thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Maynard. Sharp and impactful, very important point. Her Honour, Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm being urged, it would appear even by the microphone, to be short and to the point. I'll just make a few points very quickly, but you would know, sir, that this is hardly the kind of matter which would come to the chamber on which I would remain silent. So, again, as something debated earlier in the day, the impact, the connection, the nexus with resilience building has to be emphasized. We are facing serious and growing climate consequences. I mentioned earlier, and it has been mentioned today, that Beryl was of great intensity early in the season, and in that regard was atypical of what we could expect, we would normally expect. When we say that hurricanes or extreme weather events are increasing in frequency and in number all over the world, in frequency and in intensity, people ask, so we've encountered extreme forest fires in California, driven and unable to be quenched because of extreme heat conditions. We have had burning tarmacs, or tarmacs that were so hot that tires were melting in the United Kingdom. We've had extreme floods and heavy storms in Asia, causing Pakistan, causing loss of life and billions of dollars of damage. Across the globe, from east to west, from north to south, the changing climate is impacting us. And here, the government is attempting to put in place measures which deal with very much a traditional approach: reduce, reuse, recycle. Traditional but proven to be effective, traditional but proven to be not just effective at the national level, but because it is something in which the average householder, the average citizen can participate and play their role, which is of extreme importance. It comes out of our Debt for Nature swap. When that was initially announced, there was like, what about, we really understand that it ain't got nothing to do with we. And now you do see that it is, in fact, of relevance to every householder, because every householder uses water. Every householder uses water every day for multiple purposes, from potable use to whether it is wetting the garden, cleaning down with kennels or down houses, scrubbing out from their pigs or chickens. Water, there's water for life, water for commercial activity, water for recreation, water to support the tourism sector, and so on. So this issue of reuse, the water support for new mains and new distribution systems, which is going to emerge as a consequence of this a facility is relevant and important. The whole notion of the Debt for Nature swap is that you can buy back part of your debt or reduce your debt and use the monies that would go toward your debt payment ordinarily for matters relating to environment, and climate change would of course be our priority area. In relation to water, not just the use of water, but the fact that if we are going to have a vibrant agricultural sector, then we really need to have, our farmers need to have access to water. Increasingly now you're seeing technologies which allow crops to be grown with very little water, or crops which are being developed specifically to be drought tolerant or low in water needs. But at the moment in Barbados, we still use very much traditional farming, and in that regard, the access to water is of extreme importance. When you consider how we can be cut off by an extreme weather event, when you consider the implications of having drought and food prices going up globally and our already high food import bill, then the importance of this particular approach becomes even more apparent. We are attempting to move the Bridgetown sewage plant from primary to tertiary treatment. Bridgetown or South Coast? Bridgetown, from primary to tertiary treatment. You know, sir, it is very interesting when we developing countries, approach international development institutions, multilateral development banks, international financial institutions, however you label them. The reality is that they attach all kinds of terms and conditionalities. Sometimes these terms and conditionalities are penny-wise and pound-foolish, to use an old-time expression, sir. And I say that because we are now after the Bridgetown storage plant was built in either the 70s or the 80s. I lived in the city at the time. I lived on Baxter's Road, and I remember the controversy over the building of the Bridgetown storage plant. there is not time and people are not minded at this hour. We are going to leave to discuss it, but it really was a highly controversial issue, probably in the 1981 or so general election, and nearly cost the Barbados Labour Party the city seat as a result. In fact, yes, the folks on Emerton really comes because the community, members of the community who were relocated to Clapham in what is now a beautiful development, a lot of that community had to be moved in order to facilitate the construction of the plant and to create a buffer and so around it. Years later, history is so interesting, sir. I am going to detain the chamber just with a little history, because sometimes it is. The Bridgetown sewerage system was negotiated by Lloyd Erskine Sandyford as he then was. When the Barbados Labour Party came to government, there was fought over the campaign as whether it was necessary or not, the cost of it, the implications for the community, that the song was licking cork on the radio, as Bajans would say, and then the Barbados Labour Party came to government, and it fell to the Barbados Labour Party to complete the negotiations and construct the plant. The South Coast Sewerage Project was negotiated by Branford Tate. Another controversial project. And then the Barbados Labour Party came to government, sir, and it fell in my lap for that to be, the negotiations to be completed and for the construction of the South Coast Sewerage Project, which again caused a lot of disruption and controversy and so on. The point I'm going to make here is that the South Coast Sewerage, the West Coast, the Bridgetown Sewerage Plant was built in either the 70s or the 80s. The South Coast Sewerage Plant was built nearly 30 years later, so certainly in the 1990s, because we came to government in 94. Both were primary treatment plants. Technology had changed in the intervening period. It would have been, given the fact that at that time you could already see that we were emerging as a water-scarce country, given that we were a tourism-dependent economy, given the fact that you could use, if you went to tertiary treatment, could have had your water for multiple different uses. Singapore, sir, uses its water from sewage, treats it at such a high level that it then turns around and bottles the treated water for use as drinking water, and it is called new water. At such a high level, the technology is. No, I'm not advocating necessarily that for Bajans, because I think there would be a high level of resistance. The point that I'm making, however, is that in more than a 20-year period, when successive administrations tried to get tertiary treatment plants in Barbados, which in terms of the construction at the time, the use of the water, the benefits of the system would have been in the national interest. Those imposing the conditionalities and lending the money insisted on lower level treatment plants. So Bridgetown is a primary treatment plant, and I believe Christchurch is a second, South Coast is a secondary treatment plant, but neither one is tertiary treatment. And the country will now have to face the physical disruption, the expenditure, and the consequences of upgrading both of those plants to tertiary systems, which was what the ministers involved of successive administrations had wanted or would have wanted at the time, but could not get. That is just, sir, to give the chamber some background, and for those who like to curse politicians all the time, to understand the very real fights you have to deliver development to the citizens of your country. They do not know when you go away and sit across the table from the technocrats in the development institutions, when you have to negotiate at the international level, people who are critical do not begin to understand what it is we face. Now, that was not in my notes, sir, but I felt that I owed the chamber and the country an understanding of these processes, an understanding of how these things work, what the consequences are, why you see X happen and not Y, why Minister Q may have done X, and so on and so forth. So I've given some of the history of how the matters of soaring our country has evolved over decades. And now we have to consider, and have been contemplating, the soaring of the West Coast. That really has to be the next step as we seek to preserve our liquid waste, our sewer systems, and protect our environment from all of the consequences of a waste discharge into the natural environment. Equally, sir, the issue of separation of household waste at source is important. Part of the loan is intended to cover that. 8 million tons of plastic waste finds its way into the marine environment all over the world every year. This is not a little bit. And analyses done on human beings to try to understand the connection between plastics and the breakdown into microplastics. Honorable Senator Monroe spoke earlier about the amount of plastics blocking the drains in Christchurch and in Oistins, the breakdown of styrofoam, and it's coming up on the beaches and so on. Those microplastics, what these plastics and styrofoam break down into the smaller components end up, according to medical tests, in our bloodstream, in our lungs, in fecal discharges, all of that. So we have to be able to do the separation that is necessary to get these products out of the waste stream and create beneficial resources out of them. Plastics are being used for tiles, as construction materials, to put into road surfaces, as benches, as beach umbrellas, for a variety of things. And I see lots of people in Barbados collecting plastic bottles. You see them sometimes with, at the garbage bins. You see them with large amounts of bottles heading to the various collectors. But we have to move in Barbados from the mere collection to the manufacture of tertiary products, to take them out of the stream and to create products, other products that are useful to Barbadians and which can also then be exported. We have to create what are called virtuous or righteous cycles with cradle to grave management of waste resources, and then give them, and then resurrect them, then give them new life. So that the fact that the administration is pursuing this financing in order to address essential components of our climate change resilience building, in order to enable environmental protection, in order to start to create new industry and new business opportunities, is really very much to the advantage of the country and must be commended. Mr. President, I think that it would be useful if we are talking about the dangers of plastics and the fact that we are having debt for nature swaps and what the positive implications of the debt for nature swaps are. I think it is important too, and we could have pointed out in the last debate, that the whole initiative of the government as a global pioneer, sir, of disaster relief clauses in our sovereign debt has become of extreme importance, as was demonstrated by Beryl. People paid it not a lot of attention, although the government was talking about it. But the idea behind natural disaster clauses is that in the event of a natural disaster, instead of paying, of the kind that has hit the Grenadines, for instance, instead of paying your debt to your international creditors, you are able to suspend your loan payments for, I think, a 2 to 3 year period. Put your money, or that money that you would have been using toward debt servicing, into your national relief and rebuilding efforts. And then at the end of the 2 or 3 year period, you pick back up your debt repayments and you start back paying them again. The interest rate does not increase, but the length of the loan does. So the creditor loses nothing, and the borrower gains time and additional capital to make themselves whole again, in addition to having the leeway, the elbow room, in the event of a natural disaster. The government, sir, these things don't mean anything to the average person when you talk about them until there is a crisis. So now that Beryl has happened, and you're seeing the importance of government policy, you're seeing the importance of why it is that these particular initiatives are being pursued. You are seeing why we count these to be as important as repairing the roads, because people will tell you, oh, well, that got nothing to do with me. What would that for nature thing you talking about? I want the road outside my house repaired. I want my bus service. You are now beginning to understand that these issues have as much an equal importance for the life, well-being, and livelihoods of the average citizen as do the bread and butter issues of the bus service and the road repair, which are absolutely critical and essential, I concede. Mr. President, I am happy to be able to support this. I want to caution that for a small society, we are developing some of the worst habits of the developed world, and we are showing a developed country profile when it comes to our water usage, when it comes to the level of our waste disposal. We have become a throwaway society. You can see it in the amount of waste that we dispose per capita. You can see it in the way we live. People just throw away things and don't think about it. And they throw away because equally more is readily available and they can afford it. We have become too much of a throwaway society. Our grandparents did not live like that. The saltfish that you cooked the evening before, but as a matter of fact, pudding sauce is a typical example. Because when the pudding sauce was left over, even though the pudding and sauce were made from the waste parts of the pig, when it wasn't the full meal the evening, you get up the next morning, sir, Sunday morning, the pudding fry up and tastes real good too. And the ears and the other parts make sauce cakes or sauce patties. The features? I don't eat the features, though. I want lean sauce, please. The features are cut up and make sauce patties, and you have them with your fried pudding from the day before. We were not a waste society. We didn't throw away. We didn't take these things for granted. Yes, I know about these things. My mother, my grandmother, you know, cornmeal didn't just make the cocoa. What was left over made cornmeal pap. So we learned. It was part of our culture. We have now become a waste society. And we have to look at those things, think consciously about these adverse changes to our culture, and re-engineer the way we do things and the way we behave, particularly now because it is having such serious environmental, social, and economic consequences. I commend the government, therefore, for taking the lead on this. I want to close, therefore, sir, with an appeal. You know, I used to complain about people who are always talking about history and when there were this, that happened, or when there were that happened. And sorry, I've become one of those persons. But when I was minister, sir, in 2007, 2008, we developed a national green economy policy. It was intended, sir, to really transition the country as one of the first countries in the world to move to a national green economy. I won't go into the multiple components of it or the ways in which it was intended to do that. The international community became so excited about it that UNEP and UNDP flagged Barbados for its innovative policy approaches. The UN were citing us. The UN then, subsequently, by 2009, it took them 2 years after Barbados to develop a global green economy policy or green economy policies and to start to talk about them in their various agencies. Well, of course, by 2008, early 2008, the Barbados Labour Party had lost government and there was a new administration in place who continued to talk about the green economy. But the level of transition that was intended, the level of transition that could and should have been effected, the economic and social and environmental benefits that would have been derived had we in fact made that transition were not realized because they paid lip service to it rather than really doing the actions. In the light of our current climate change crisis across the globe, in the light of the fact that Barbados is still attempting to transition toward green energy, that we are now talking about the interconnected blue economy, which also has to be pursued in a green and sustainable way, in view of the fact that our food import bill is rising while our water level is shrinking, while we need to get green energy, in view of all the challenges that we're facing and the absolute imperatives for maintaining our quality of life, I believe that the government has to take back up this business of transitioning to a green economy as one of its flagship policies. And it can only be done if the government is prepared to engage, employ, appoint, however you want to term it, a green economy champion for Barbados, whose responsibility it would be to work across ministries and to work with the private sector to ensure that a green economy at the national level is put in place. And that is the appeal, sir, on which I would wish to end. It is not that I am living in the past. It is that we were visionary and prescient in terms of the policy formulation at the time, which is now needed more than ever. And in that regard, if we are to effect the policy changes, we have to have the structures and the architecture and the people necessary to ensure success of the policy and national implementation across both the public and private sectors. Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Senator Thompson. Senator Dr. Moroni, please close.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to thank the Honourable Senator Maynard, as well the Honourable Deputy President for their interventions, all of which, Mr. President, I've agreed with. As I said before, the government is intended to roll out a multifaceted education and awareness campaign. And as Senator Maynard would have indicated, to look at the issue of cisterns. That's something that I would have to put before the Barbados Water Authority and see how it can be included in the education campaign. And then also as well, thanking the Deputy Madam President for her intervention, which highlighted the number of ways that Barbados is leading in the climate arena. And as I said, that adds to what we are doing here under this project and the complete build out of our leadership when it comes to water, when it comes to how we address water scarcity, when it comes to how we address the complexity of the challenges facing the sector, so that we then once again can create a pathway for other countries, create a framework that others can continue to build on. Mr. President, I also take the point in respect to the fact that Barbados is becoming what was termed a throwaway society. Within the creative sector, Mr. President, there is a move now to look at how we use some of those materials that we throw away to make them into art, even wearable art. As well, Mr. President, so that we are having complete fashion shows that are just about using sustainable materials, sustainable resources. And in Africa as well, you're seeing that particularly putting into practice, where again, you have creatives that are using plastics and either making mats and other very, very practical things out of those materials, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, with those few words, I want to ask that this resolution be now passed. I want to beg, sorry, Mr. President, this resolution be now passed.
The question is that this resolution do not pass. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. I think the ayes have it. This resolution is now passed. Could we recommit announcements, please, Mr. Clerk? Announcements. With the recommittal of announcements, just wanted to share correspondence from Senator Most Honourable Jerome Walcott. Dear Mr. President, I write to inform you of my inability to attend sittings of the Senate occasioned by an injury sustained due to a fall, for which I indicated he had surgery. Given my continued improvement and rehabilitation, I'm hopeful that I will be able to attend the Senate before the end of July 2024. So there's good news as a follow-up to the earlier, or the several weeks for absence, and we note that for the record. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And we certainly, I know I can speak on this occasion for all honourable senators. We wish Senator the Most Honourable Jerome Walcott a speedy recovery as he continues, as he has said in his own words, to improve. With this concluding government's business for the remainder of today, I beg to move that the Senate do be adjourned sine die.
The question is that the Honourable the Senate do now adjourn sine die. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The next the ayes have it. The Senate is therefore adjourned sine die.